how much difference does any of this actually make? Let's ask our triad of pastors. Well, now, just to get a sense for whether any of this really makes a difference or not, I want you to listen to 2 audio-only clips, okay? You won't be able to see the preacher. You won't see whether his eyes are up or down, you know, whatever he's doing with a manuscript or no manuscript. Can't see that. All you'll be able to do is hear. And I want you to hear whether you can actually sense a difference between what's going on in the first preacher and the second preacher. Now, I'll add this. The first preacher is a dearly beloved, incredibly gifted professor of homiletics who, during his career, taught at both seminaries, and now he's been in heaven for a number of years, okay? What you'll hear is very good. And if you were to hear his sermons from start to finish, we'd all love them, okay? But I want you to hear that clip as it is, and then the one to follow, and see if you just get a different sense of what the preacher is intending to do in the way he delivers the sermons, okay? Just a very brief clip on each one, and let's hear the first one.
In this chapter to the 1 Corinthians, Paul has just made this familiar statement, "For we do not preach ourselves, but Christ as Lord. And we have this treasure in jars of clay, earthen vessels. The power is from God, not from us. We always carry around in our body the death of Jesus, so that the life of Jesus may be revealed in our body." And in verse 12, Paul says, "So then death is at work in us." Paul is speaking of his own ministry, verse 1 of this chapter, and his own afflictions, mentioned in verses 7 to 11. His reward is that while death works in him, he rejoices that life is at work in his hearers. In this way he is a little Christ to the Corinthians.
Okay? Now here's the second clip. I'll never forget the very last Bible class session that I taught in my last congregation before coming here to teach. We'd been going for many weeks through 1 Corinthians. And now this very last Sunday, we had to cram in chapters 15 and 16 to pretend we were finished. Right? 1 Corinthians chapter 15, St. Paul's great resurrection chapter. Right? And in the discussion, one of my elders raised his hand and he said, "But of course, Pastor, we're not going to have bodies in heaven." Whoa! I've been there 10 years, and I haven't made that clear enough? Okay, you heard the 2 clips, and obviously I would have to be the one to apologize for the second one. The first one needs no apology whatsoever. Both, I think, are actually done well. But actually, the preachers did have a different intent as to what they were doing in delivery. Did you get a sense at all for a different sound between the two? Yeah. How so? What was different?
Second one was more animated.
Okay.
Could sense that.
Okay, all right. First one?
It felt almost too polished in the sense that it doesn't sound like you would hear someone if you were just having a normal conversation.
Yeah. Exactly. And here's the deal. The preacher who did the first segment, as I said, a very esteemed homiletics professor, brilliant professor, really. His approach to delivery for himself was to read the sermon. And he said, for example, his eyes would be up 4/5 of the time, 80% of the time. The huge majority of the time, his eyes would be up looking at the hearers, right? But he really did intend to read the sermon. Now the second one, obviously, well, that was me, and that is an example of what I try to do by delivering the sermon live and in person, thinking in thoughts. Okay? We don't have to evaluate better, worse, or something like that, but what I do want to point out, or suggest at least, is that whether one is reading the sermon or whether one is delivering the sermon by thinking in thoughts actually does impact all of the major elements of sermon delivery. The one that's obvious, of course, when you watch someone read a sermon or watch someone speak in conversation is the eyes. We all know that. And we talk, of course, about eye contact being an important ingredient in any kind of speaking. The fact is, I don't actually, when I evaluate my students, I don't refer to eye contact at all. Instead, what I call that category is relationship to hearers. The eyes are something, but there's a lot more involved in the relationship to hearers than just the eyes being up or down. In fact, someone who memorizes a sermon is going to have his eyes up all the time, but sometimes there's still a great distance that comes between the preacher and the hearers, because in memorizing a sermon, he essentially is trying to replicate words. I kind of refer to it as reading the imaginary teleprompter. Okay? But even in the clip you just heard where you couldn't see the eyes, if you could sense a difference in the sound, that's not surprising. There really is a different tone, audio only, between reading and live conversation. It's a different sound. And no matter how hard we try, unless we're professional actors who are able to actually convince that this is really happening, any reading sounds different than live conversation. Is it bad? No, it's not bad. But it does create a distance. The relationship to hearers is not as intimate when everyone knows that what he's doing essentially is the same whether I'm here or not. It's well prepared. In this case, fabulous sermons, right? But there is a distance that reading creates between the preacher and the hearers. And the only thing unfortunate about that is that unless the sermon is as brilliantly written as this professor would always write his sermons, it is generally more difficult for people to remain engaged. People are very used to conversation, as we've said before. People do it all week long. We do it very successfully, both on the speaking end and the receiving end. The fact is, adults are not accustomed to being read to very often. When we're small children, we're read to frequently, but later on in life, we just don't get a lot of practice in listening to someone read to us. And the distance that it creates and the lower engagement level that comes usually means that someone will have a difficult time processing as many of those 15 to 18 to 20 minutes as if the conversation is happening live and in person. That's just one element. Other elements of sermon delivery are all impacted. It may have been a little silly, but at the end of that second clip, when the pastor, realizing that after 10 years he had not communicated clearly enough to one of his elders the reality of the resurrection, okay, well, that drove the preacher live and in person in the pulpit to kind of throw up his auditory hands and say, whoa! Yeah. And probably, though we didn't see it, it probably caused him to throw up his real hands as well.
Sure.
See, the tone is impacted. More intense kind of tone. The physical movements are impacted. The volume is impacted. The pacing is impacted. For example, reading generally has a more rapid pace than thinking thoughts. Why? Well, simply because when you're reading, job one is to replicate this word, and once that job's accomplished, it's time for the next word, and the next word after that, and the next word after that. Whereas in conversation, we know good and well that just because you finished a sentence doesn't mean it's quite time for the next sentence yet, or the next phrase. See, and that kind of sense of timing that comes with real live conversation is usually difficult to replicate in reading, which means that reading normally gives the hearers less processing time, which is very, very important, than if we're actually dialoguing together, even though the preacher's the only one talking. He's still dialoguing with the hearers and sensing whether he's gotten closure on an element, whether they've comprehended, whether we're ready to go on. Mm-hmm. So the fact of the matter is, at least my contention is, that this thinking in thoughts thing actually impacts every aspect of preaching, from the projection, to the pacing, to the tone, to the physical movements, certainly also to the relationship to hearers.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there was I heard in the two, with yours, there were what we might call vocalized pauses. You get to the end of a sentence, you say, I forget, it was something like, you hear, or...
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, sure.
And you can't write that into a reading.
Right.
It would come out I mean, reading, in a sense, reading is more refined, and I think people almost
Absolutely.
like a little rougher, if I might say it that way.
A little imperfection.
Yeah.
By the way, while you mentioned that, Tom, it's well worth pointing out, if people are hearing this thinking and thoughts thing and reacting in a way that says, gee, I don't know if I can do this because I won't be smooth. Well, the fact of the matter is, when you deliver a sermon by thinking and thoughts, you're going to have a ton of imperfections.
Yeah.
Just like we do in conversation all the time. It just doesn't bother us at all. Whereas even the slightest little glitch in reading is actually a mistake.
Yeah.
It's not just where you start in one direction and double clutch in another direction. It's clearly an error which stands out in everyone's mind. And so the truth of the matter is, while you're going to have a lot more glitches when you're thinking in thoughts, the net effect, at least when you develop the skill a bit, is going to be much smoother than even almost, but not quite, perfect reading. Bottom line then is that it's well worth considering how this thinking and thoughts thing actually impacts each of the major elements of sermon delivery.